Hello, good morning. This is Dr. Iftikhar Ansari, Department of Political Science, Aligarh Muslim University. Today in my presentation, I'll be talking about forms of government, and in that forms of government, I'll be talking about the aristocratic form. So, aristocracy is a form of a government which we find a rule, which is a rule of few in number. Now, a state basically is a political community which is made up of people of diverse interest, even members of the same family. We find them having diverse interests. So, members of the state have diverse goals, diverse ambitions, and all aim at different things. But somehow, with the presence of high plurality among individuals that form the state, there are strong similarities as well. Now, this is the reason why Aristotle in his book Politics argued that the goal of every state is to attain common good. Now, this common good is in what sense common? So, what will be the stated as common good is difficult, if not impossible, to identify. Now, because of there being a generality of the concept tagging everything good or bad, it's difficult to locate what stands for good. So, some argue that it is either the good of the majority, or some say it's the good of the minority, or no good. So, the government is an institution which is made to serve the general purpose of the state, and general purpose involves the common good of all the individuals. So, common good can be achieved if the state generally is a service state. So, the government is thus a machinery of state made by the state to achieve the common good of the state, that is the people themselves. So, aristocracy, when we talk about aristocracy, also is a form of government, and as many forms of government we have, one of these forms is aristocracy, which I stated earlier that it is the rule of the few, and the few are considered the best. So, originally aristocracy meant that form of government which was conducted by the best men of the community and was guided in the exercise of authority and functions by the most virtuous principles. Now, such a form of government comes down to us from Plato down from Aristotle to the present. So, Aristos in Greek means the best, and kratos means the power. So, the aristocracy, according to Greek philosopher and the philosophy, was a form of government which was par excellence. Its principle was virtue, and they promoted morality, and superiority of intelligence was their hallmark, and by that they come to acquire a position of rulers in that society. So, the intellectual superiority of the ruling class and their virtuous qualities, they disseminated into those whom they ruled, and that is why it was considered as the best, because they promoted among the people the morality and intelligence by sharing their own intelligence and their own morality by doing or performing in the best of interest of the individuals. So, aristocracy has now come to signify that form of government in which the political power rests in the hand of the small section of community. That is what I said in the beginning, but earlier it was considered as the rule of the best. So, this is not but the real test of what is aristocracy. It's really oligarchy, which we are talking about, rule of the few, and the few who are working in their own interest. That becomes oligarchy according to the classification of government done by Aristotle. So, the character of aristocracy depends on the method of selection of the people who are going to wield power, and the aims that they keep in view and they pursue, not the smallness of the number who are the rulers, which determines their being called an aristocrats. So, the methods of selection are various and have been devised in accordance with certain leading ideas which have pervaded, and they still pervade society. First, there is the idea of importance of birth. Now, in primitive societies, families most directly descending from a common ancestor, they constituted a class by itself in which outsiders were not admitted, except perhaps by adoption. In modern societies, we do not speak of a common ancestor, but we still refer to the notion that some families are better than others, and consequently, they are best fitted to rule. So, in the second place, selection may be by merit, that is, person of superior intelligence and ability are chosen to govern others. Now, this is aristocracy of intelligence. When selection of rulers are made in favor of another method, which is called a selection by favor, that is providing any favor to one individual. So, when a king conferred high rank on those who serve him best, the method of selection is by favor. So, again there may be an aristocracy of wealth. So, when the criterion of selection is only the possession of riches that one come to acquire, so at that time it is called an aristocracy of rich. So, here the poor, whatever be their intellect or merit, have no chance to assume public office and participate in public life. So, it means some are born to rule, and if they happen to inherit wealth or amass it themselves, whereas others to be ruled if the accident of birth or circumstances do not make them so fortunate. So, Jelinek has made emphasis on the social aspect of aristocracy. He maintains that there is always some social class in society which wields the dominant power in the state. So, it may be the priestly class, it may be the military class, it may be landed aristocracy, but whatever be the type, the power will belong to that social class which is more powerful than the rest. And this class enjoys certain special privileges which are denied to other classes. So, Jelinek accordingly concludes that it's an error to define aristocracy mainly as a government by a few, because it's a class of people who are the rulers after all, and who come to identify themselves as best in their merit, could be, or in their birth, or could be the riches that they have acquired. So, one of these criteria are taken as the basis of their selection. So, if you talk about kind of aristocracy, aristocracy for Aristotle was a normal form of government. Its perversion became oligarchy. So, governed by the few, that is by the rich or for the rich. So, when the few people worked in the interest of the community, it was aristocracy. But when the same rulers or few people who started amassing wealth and started working in their own interest, then it became oligarchy. So, Rousseau divided aristocracy into three, saying aristocracy, one is the natural, other is elective, and third form is hereditary. And this hereditary form he considers as the worst form, and elective form is the best. So, the general basis of classification has been of wealth, of birth, of talent, intellect, of culture and education. So, some writers have during recent times used the term aristodemocracy for aristocracy. So, aristodemocracy means that only best type of men wield power. So, in a sense, a democratic government is more or less aristocratic in that a considerable portion of the population takes no part in government, and the greater share of the government or the governing power is concentrated in the hand of comparatively small people. Now, this is what the theory, the elitist theory of government or governance, it describes that always the government is controlled by few elites who are distinctive in their merit or in their intellect. So, the public opinion is influenced, and it is molded and shaped by the leadership of a few. Ultimately, this is what the reality, and the majority party forms the government, and its leaders man the administration. So, the majority party together with minority in the legislature, they enact laws, and the masses, they simply elect their representatives and leave the rest to the actual administrators till they are called upon to elect the rulers again. So, the line between aristocracy and democracy is therefore difficult to draw. Now, it must be remembered that aristocracy places no confidence in the ability of the masses, and it's the government of the selected few, and maybe the aristocracy of breeding, or aristocracy of intellect, or aristocracy of talent. So, whereas the democracy has faith in ability and capacity of man, and its principle is equality. So, it accepts man or as a man and provides equal opportunity to all to rise to the highest public office in the state. Thus, all persons who are fit to perform the duties of a citizen can have a share in the direction of the affairs of the state. So, that is what democracy come to signify, and also aristocracy. So, its combination more or less is what is found in democracy in present day, where it is said to be representative democracy. But in reality, it's an estro-democracy which is being in practice. Then if we look at the merit of aristocracy, we find one of the greatest merit of aristocracy is that it emphasizes quality and not quantity. It assumes that some of the better fitted are the ones who should be provided an opportunity to govern. So they govern us as the best, and the criterion of being best is their moral and intellectual superiority which they possess over others. So it is over lasting privilege, says Carlyle, of the foolish to be governed by the wise, and aristocracy thus gives to the community a ruling class which can be trusted to administer public affairs with complete integrity and honor, because they possess great position independent of politics. So these individuals, they have power of perception. I mean, that is what differentiates them from others, usually which is denied to others or the masses. That is the perceptual power, and they can see the order in human affair. They can discern the major trends that are obscure to the generality of their fellow citizens, and they rise above emotions and their personal interest, and can see the meaning of justice and virtue in the way the others cannot, and that differentiates them from others, and that is why they have that capability to administer, to govern a country or a society. So aristocracy can also claim superiority over the other forms of government in respect of the stability it provides and the efficiency with which it runs the government, and thus can maintain a consistent and vigorous policy both in domestic and foreign relations. Now, John Mill said that the government which have been remarkable in history for sustained ability and vigor in the conduct of affairs have generally been aristocracies. Now, it is further argued that aristocracy would refrain from an unwise and immoderate use of power. So, Burke believed that the elite of a society would be more realistic than the common people. The aristocrat, he further said, has more of a sense of shame, because he must ask himself what posterity will think of his actions, what future generations will think of what he has done. So out of shame, they remain on the right path, and this shameness cannot be expected from the majority of the people, the masses who are there to be ruled. So this differentiates an aristocrat from others. So supporters of aristocracy of breeding, they defend hereditary aristocracy on the ground that genetic inheritance produces superior qualities in certain family lines, and having roots in their national tradition and being able to take a long-range perspective on the future. So the approach of aristocracy and aristocrats in politics is conservative at the best of their senses. So political training runs in their blood, because they have the experience of doing that, and they take naturally to business of government more efficiently and more diligently than others. So they represent a standard of perfection which was derived from hereditary lineage that they have and the environment within which they are brought up, and they set a model for others to imitate as well as revere. So since members of this aristocracy have maintained security, they enter political life out of sheer sense of duty, and they can thus promote the broader interest of society and do not have to pander to the momentary whims of a capricious electorate in a democratic form. So having these qualities differentiates them, and it is in the best interest of a country to have such aristocrats or aristocratic form of government which sets a model for others to imitate by their sheer administrative skill, their experience, and finally bringing about the best form of government. Now, aristocracy, it is claimed, is preeminently conservative, since administration rests in the hands of the wise, the talented, the experienced administrators who have inherited a high tradition of public service. They would naturally avoid rash decisions and radical political experiments. So by nature, they are conservative. Moreover, stability is one of the most requirements of a good government, and stability is what they provide. So stability demands conservative innovation, and this conservativeness is what is the hallmark of aristocracy. So violent changes involving suppression of institutions which become vulnerable with age or which agitates people's feeling as such, endangering the stability of a government. It is therefore of greater importance in social and political progress that people of progress, people of liberalism should always be joining the principle of stability and supporting conservatism. So aristocracy serves the desired purpose, that is the purpose of stability, the purpose of innovation, and innovation that is steady, that is brought about in a long term. It's not a sudden and momentary process. So it allows only slow changes, and there is no complete break with the past. So aristocracy is a reservoir which conserves the experience and transmits that wisdom to the present as well as to the future generation. So conservativeness, continuity, and stability are the essential conditions of a country's progress. And Montesquieu very correctly pointed out that moderation is the chief principle of aristocracy, and this is what brings about a stability in our country's politics. So in modern, if we look at the modern features and see the aristocratic kind of government or the practices which are there, we find in cabinet government, it is in essence aristocratic form that we find, because those who constitute the ministry are party leaders, and according to Lasky, the essential contribution of the ministers to the cabinet is their common sense, their ability to put before their colleagues that judgment about the decision which matches with public opinion and which establishes party opinion will make after all the due deliberations, and then it is consulted and practiced. So this is aristocracy tinged with responsibility. So modern governments have preserved the elements of aristocracy within them in the composition of upper house of their legislature as well. For instance, the British House of Lords, consisting primarily of hereditary peers, in countries where second chamber are elected, and elections are usually so arranged as to make them representative of the best mind in the nation. The Council of States, the second chamber in India, consists of 250 members, of whom 12 members are nominated by the President. So the numbers nominated by the President are persons having special knowledge and practical experience in respect of such matters as legislature or as matters of law or literature, science, art, and social service. So this system of representation is aristocratic in the best sense. Then if you look at the weaknesses of aristocracy, we find that the evils inherent in all kinds of aristocracy are that they form a separate interest which is almost certain to come into conflict with the interest of the community. So the class interest which it comes to secure and its clash with the mass interest or common interest is what is detrimental to this form of government. So no wise and just principle has so far been devised for the selection of the ruling class, and no safeguard has been suggested to ensure that the few will rule in the interest of all, not for their selfish advantage, but for the welfare of the masses. So the privileged person who are designed to rule form a class of their own vested interests, and they look on their privileges as a matter of right which ought to be transmitted unimpaired to their successors. Now this approach militates against the very idea of democracy based on equality. So even aristocracy of the best, it soon degenerates into a class rule which is flushed with power and authority. They become arrogant and proud and display towards the classes which excludes them to having a share in the government. So this harshness and cruelty which come in its fold is intolerable and it is exhibited in the form of the contempt that they have for the masses, which is what is its greatest weakness. So even an aristocracy of intellect has no convincing appeal to make or to convince that this is the right criteria of selecting aristocrats. So high intelligence is not the exclusive property of any single group or any single family who claims that it needs to be transmitted or it is transmitted to their hereditary or their sons and children and other progenies who need to be included in the ruling class. And the rational individuals are distributed at random up and down the social scale. That is what the experience shows. And of course, a person from a wealthy background stands a better chance of having his intellectual potentialities developed to its optimum, for he will be receiving encouragement from the parents and from the benefits of higher education that he comes to have. So however, experience has further shown that many of our fittest and finest intellectuals have sprung from humble backgrounds, and many of them have all but educated themselves. So the rule of hereditary succession, the aristocracy of breeding, that is what it is labeled as, works as evil as well as the good. So when it has prevailed for a long time, a considerable number of hereditary dignitaries descend to persons quite unfit to exercise power or to make a good use of social influence. Moreover, the division of people into classes, this provokes envy and opposition among the people, and the rulers become narrow, they become selfish, and they become domineering, causing widespread disaffection, and eventually it leads to rebellion. So it's not a rational idea to put faith in the myth that some are born to rule and others to be ruled. So such a government is unresponsive and irresponsible, for it excludes the masses from finding interest in government. So they become only recipient of orders, which is not what 21st century supports. So aristocracy therefore is exclusive. It does not offer the people the political training or political consciousness, which is so essential for citizenship in the 21st century. So it's a government for passive, dumb-driven creatures and not for politically awakened and active citizens. So similarly, a property like birth should not be the criterion of elevation or elevating a person to the position of a ruler. So governing power cannot be wisely restricted to persons who either by accident of birth or are born in rich families, or to whom some freak of fortune has brought riches. So such fortunate persons, when in power, devise all means to perpetuate their own interest. That is what experience shows, and they reduce the masses to a pitiable plight which is to be avoided at all cost. So a great defect of aristocracy, says bluntly, is its excessive rigidity. A government which has reverence for long-established customs and traditions cannot have a dynamic outlook. So a good government must keep pace with the economic and social requirements of society. And aristocracy will resist all such changes and changes in government in order to preserve itself or preserve fulfilling its requirement of power. So it cannot be expected to have a dynamic nature or dynamic way of looking at the changes. So its mechanism cannot therefore serve the purpose of the modern age. It stands for backwardness, it stands for conservatism. So finally, aristocracy stands for pomp, it stands for splendor and all this grandeur and dignity. This entails a huge expenditure and extravagance at the very high cost of public good and the means. Now, in final conclusion, what we find is that the aristocracy in its purest form has outlived its utility, and it finds existence only in its form where it appeals to reason, or it can invite, or it can mold itself or change itself according to the changing situation and become more dynamic in its approach. Now, it is a fact that some elite are always there in every form of government, who are there to administer, who are there to govern, but then their selection should be always on the basis of the merit and always on the basis of the development which they promote in the bargain, instead of developing their own class kind of identity which militates or which goes against the interests of the masses. So, with that I come to the end of the forms of government that I have presented about aristocracy. Thank you.